1022.
All right, here we go, this 3 o'clock hour. We'll have Dan Lust here momentarily, sports law attorney on the National Labor Relations Board, and the opinion that was released a couple of days ago. A lot of you had a lot of information and opinions on that. In fact, if you want, for those of you texting us, 254-339-1122, on the chat room, if you have a question for Dan Lust, sports law attorney on the National Labor Relations Board and the opinion, we'd love for you to send that to us. We'll try to turn around and ask him as well. Dan joins us on SICM 365 Radio and 365 Sports. Dan, was that even something you saw on the radar?
No, certainly not at all. I think in hindsight, kind of looking back, is it conceivable that the NLRB would have done this? And we can kind of get into the reasoning. Sure, I think it's possible that they would have revisited this guidance and issued this, but yeah, it wasn't on my radar. And within kind of 90 days of this NIL era, hindsight being 2020, sure, but I don't think anyone was expecting this to happen as it did.
So Dan, we've gotten a lot of legitimately good questions about it since the news broke, but I mean there are things like what is the employee value? Is it the scholarship because they're not getting cash from the universities? NIL comes from outside employees, so then they wouldn't necessarily be university employees. Where is the standing to make the case that they are employees?
I mean, listen, I guess from a really high level, the argument has always been there, right? They are acting in a way and they're making profits for the particular university. So at a high level, like, what are employees? Employees confer some type of benefit on their employer. They work together, right? It's not that crazy. We've always had that conversation. Why this hasn't really been, we'll say, litigated or discussed. Back in 2014, you guys, I'm sure, know this, but Northwestern tried to unionize, and NLRB, and Northwestern, just like Baylor, is a private institution. NLRB didn't say yes or no; they just kind of kicked the can down the road. So, the question is, has this really been tested in a really substantive way? Not really. And the general counsel over at the NLRB is kind of saying, hey, if another school wants to test this like Northwestern once did, and they're a private institution, I think they're giving them a signal that, hey, we might actually want to take this and give you official, employee status. So in that sense, it's very big, but on a kind of granular level, nothing has changed today. It's just kind of a signal that, hey, things might get different once someone tests it.
Yeah, and so if no one tests it, then it just kind of remains as is. Is that how you see it?
Right. It's an advisory opinion. She's issuing a memo, and I will say, for those that don't know the history, in 2017, a couple of years ago, a general counsel with the NLRB, I'm not going to remember the name, but issued a very similar opinion saying that I think student athletes should be considered employees, and if someone wants to test this, we'll reconsider it. And everyone, at the time thought it was kind of a big deal. And then, they had a new general counsel 12 months later, and then that general counsel rescinded that memo. So nothing really happened. And now this memo is kind of a rescinding of the rescinding, and now it's kind of back in place. So, we didn't have any unionization in that 3-4 year period. So, it could be something, could be nothing. But I guess on a kind of a informational level, this is starting this conversation, which is healthy, for better, for worse. People are talking about it. They had a hearing on Capitol Hill yesterday, and Mark Emmert, was asked about it. So I think the timing was so this would get brought up to Mark Emmert so people in the college space could talk about it. But, yeah, I think it's definitely a conversation starter.
In fact, Baylor President Dr. Linda Livingstone was there, and I was able to watch part of the testimony, and it was brought up. And again, I don't know if that group ever does anything other than just meet and talk and try to hit the whatever their constituents want, not so much politically, just about anything. We know what the NCAA's done is kick the can down the road. So what is the deadliest part? If, in fact, college athletics, if, in fact, the National Labor Relations Board, if, in fact, this was to happen, what are one or two of the biggest or deadliest things to college athletics? Health insurance, strikes, what do you think could be damaging?
I think those are probably the biggest two. And then there's this big question, right? We are employees in some sense. I guess most people listen to this. Some people probably work for themselves. But I don't know, could you fire could you cut somebody from the school? Right? We've been on this thing. Hey, if you don't perform up to par, you're still on scholarship, right? You might hit the bench, but you're not going to get cut from the school. It's just such a weird concept. I was talking to a friend of mine on the agency side today, and he was asking me, is this possible? And I'm like, I'm like, truthfully, I can't really conceive of what this world would look like. Is it possible that we have this, debate? This could, we could have the unionization occur in the next 10 years. Sure. It's just such a far-fetched concept that I can't even conceive of it. So think about it from a professional level. We have our 4 unions in the 4 major sports. MLS has a union. They sit down every couple of years and they hammer out a collective bargaining agreement. This is going to be unique because it's almost as if it's kind of more akin, at least the way that I'm envisioning it. Like we have the Players Association for the NFL negotiating with the owners. So all of the teams are represented in the owners kind of facet. Here, you might have individual schools that are trying to unionize. Remember, the NLRB only is going to be binding on the private institutions. So the Big 12, there's 2 schools. It's Baylor and TCU. Big 10, for example, it's just Northwestern. So this, guidance only impacts a really small subset of schools. Can you imagine if in our world of college sports, some schools unionized and other ones didn't? I'm still kind of wrapping my head around it. But yeah, you could have labor strikes. You could be, David, to your point, you could have this very, weird world where you have to pay insurance. You have to give them a piece of pie, just like we have in pro sports collective bargaining agreements. The piece of the revenue pie, 100% of the pie, players ask for a piece of it, owners ask for a piece of it. And then, if they can't agree, right, there are lockouts, there are strikes. You could have, no team that's fielded because they refuse to play. And before we say this is so far-fetched, guys, I don't know, within the last year, Pac-12 players, all these guys banded together. We kind of got lost in the shuffle of the pandemic, but they put out a memo, players banded together and said, hey, we want health insurance, we want to be protected, we want long-term disability benefits, and we're not going to play until we get it. Now, the pandemic season kind of canceling it kind of mooted the point, but there are active players in college right now that have made those type of demands. So, you kind of be kidding yourself to say that players aren't going to test this at some point in the near future.
Dan, you mentioned that this, as of right now, would apply to private schools and not public institutions. So a TCU, a Baylor, yes, they would have to potentially deal with things like strikes and all that, but this could also be something that would be advantageous, correct? I mean, could you see a situation where the public schools look at the private schools and see themselves at a bit of a disadvantage? Because while there is the risk of a strike and whatnot, you could also have the benefits if things were going well. Does that make sense?
Yeah. This is the one I'm still trying to wrap my head around. Like, at a certain sense, I think everybody, and I've been on your show, guys, I've talked about this 100 times. Everybody likes NIL. I don't want to say everybody, but 90% of people like NIL. Every state that it goes through, it passes unanimously. It has bipartisan support because who's paying the athletes, right? These outside third-party vendors. The school is not losing money. You're just basically finding another way to support these athletes, and it doesn't have to come through the school. Now, schools, I would think, aren't going to love this question of unionization and collective bargaining because they will lose a piece of the pie. All the different television deals that they sign, all the tickets that they, get, and the merchandise concessions, that's potentially up for grabs if you have some type of collective bargaining. So could a public university see this and let's say we play devil's advocate, TCU and in this crazy world unionizes and Baylor and Northwestern, these private institutions, would those schools be kind of from a recruiting standpoint, be at an advantage because players want to go to a school where they get a piece of the ticket gates and whatnot? Sure, but I don't think schools like the public institutions, be it Texas, Oklahoma, I don't think they would be. I think they would rather have a non-unionization. I think all employers would rather not have that. But from a competitive standpoint, I think if you're a player, you'd rather go to a union-based school. So yeah, it would certainly throw college sports on their head. And the amount of money that you could get at a private unionized school would seemingly be much more than a player could get seemingly a loan from NIL. So it's this crazy world. It's almost like a black hole that's opened up that we can kind of see in, but I don't know. You don't really know what's on the other side of it.
All right, Dan, I've got some questions from our YouTube chat for you. Okay, a couple of them I'm going to kind of combine because they fall into the same thing. So could you see lawsuits for issues like CTE? You already talked about health insurance, or maybe like Arizona State, if they're found guilty of, whatever happened during COVID, if any of these guys got COVID and have lasting effects from that little recruiting trip, could they also now sue Arizona State in the future as a union?
Yeah, I mean, that's the fear, right? And I don't want to say the fear, but you owe your employees certain rights that you don't necessarily, as an institution, you owe players, anybody on your campus, a safe place to play or to walk around. but you owe a higher obligation to your employees. So, yeah, I mean, you could always see lawsuits like that now, but that the duty of care is much higher as an employer to an employee. And then, in a very weird sense, there's this other kind of rabbit hole you could go down. If an employee does something wrong and it's within the scope of their employment, now you have this kind of element of what's called vicarious liability, that the school could be on the hook if one of their employees does something inappropriate. I don't know. It's this insane world. But yeah, you could certainly see lawsuits stemming from this, just like we saw, with the NFL with these series of concussion lawsuits and this whole, long-term disability benefits that's paid out for concussions. You could see something like that. It's not crazy. I'm having a hard time envisioning, schools unionizing, which is kind of akin to our individually like pro teams unionizing. Like if the Texans were union based, but the Dallas Cowboys were not. We haven't seen something like that in sports. So I don't know. Yeah, certainly you could see more lawsuits, but it would kind of throw, recruiting and just school to school comparisons kind of on their head.
Okay, you brought up another interesting point, which a listener had a question for. So say a player gets involved in an off-field infraction, does the university still have the power to bench him, or does it go into court and he continues to play because of the union might have power to keep them playing?
What we have in our pro sports, we have this grievance system that it avoids issues going to court. It plays out privately. Maybe they don't just sit him, right? Maybe they just cut him and they cut him out of the school, which I guess you can still do. You can dismiss a guy from the program. You can always do that. But you might have an internal kind of tribunal hearing with a particular grievance, not maybe so dissimilar that happens at schools already with the disciplinary board. It's certainly a different world. I don't know that necessarily will create more lawsuits. Because you could still have kind of fights through the union that don't get to court, but you might have lawsuits for the right to unionize. So we'll see. It's kind of a mixed bag. I'm still trying to get my head around what it would look like. But you guys saw I put up a poll and I put it underneath my post, kind of promoting the show. And I think people are predicting that this will happen in the next decade. So that conversation's not that far away.
Dan, there's so much that's changing in college athletics as we're addressing here. Do you think that the student athletes, or even though that's the buzz term now, the athletes need to be, I don't know, this might sound strange, be careful in a way that they are kind of along for the ride, and a lot of people maybe have interests that are not necessarily for the benefit of the student athlete, although it's disguised as that. Like, there's so much changing. Could you look up and all of a sudden, like, let's change, and then all of a sudden there's basketball programs being eliminated because schools can't afford this, and you actually end up in a world where there's less opportunity than the opportunities they had previously?
Yeah, and I think this is the earlier question that Dave asked that I meant to get to, and I've talked about this with you guys in, like, the rabbit hole of NIL. If there's a world, right, like, where, we'll play this down 10, 15 years down the road. If, hey, these endorsers and these kind of these programs or the businesses don't want to give money to the school anymore, they want to go directly to the players. Maybe 10, 15 years down the road, that could, you'd lose some money from the program each year from the institution, and then maybe they'd have to do away with some sports, just like they did during the pandemic. Those non-revenue generating sports disappeared because there wasn't enough money to feed all these programs. So you take that and you kind of supercharge it with the potential unionization issue. If the college football program lost money, right, they just lost 40% of the pie, and it wasn't because of the pandemic, it went to the players, that would certainly impact the rest of the sports within a particular, university or college. As you guys know, which I'm sure the listeners of the program know, by and large, it's football is this huge moneymaker, and then basketball, and those two sports tend to pay for the rest of the sports. So if you were to lop off 40% of the revenue, and that went to the players' pockets for any individual program, yeah, that would have tremendous ramifications on the rest of the sports offerings at the school. So, the world that we've lived in for the last decade, football can live kind of copacetic with basketball and softball and wrestling and swimming and all these other sports. But in a world where it's unionized, I certainly see those two sports potentially. If you lose money from football and basketball, it's going to harm the rest of the offering. So, I kind of mentioned it, like, everybody loves NIL because it's, these outside businesses paying these athletes, but not everybody's going to love this unionization concept. It could really, for better or for worse, I don't know, depending on what perspective you're on, it could just obliterate amateurism. And I don't know what the difference at that point would be between pro sports and college sports. It's seemingly identical if you have a real union that pops in.
What will be the challenge legally? Title IX, some people get that mixed up now because of the sexual assault and how schools handle things on campus. And that's for all students. What about Title IX, the old Title IX, where it was developed for equality for women's sports and athletics? If, in fact, you start losing 40% of what you gain revenue-wise, isn't that going to be a challenge to try to be equal with women's scholarships and men's scholarships? We hear about maybe losing women's sports, but wouldn't you actually start losing men's sports?
You would be, but maybe you would be losing. And the short answer is yes. I think, you can read it either way. Men's basketball and men's football are two big money makers,
right.
And they support all the other sports, be it men's or women's sports. So if you're cutting sports kind of uniformly, and it's not with respect to men's or women's, maybe you can get around it. Maybe you get around the fact that, hey, the schools aren't really making that decision. These unions are forcing them to make decisions. It's not based on men's or women's issues. We just can't afford to have this long of a roster of sports. We can't have 40 Division I sports. We have to pare back. So maybe you get around it on that sense. But, if you're just worried about women's sports being protected overall, this is certainly going to throw a monkey wrench in the college sports economic tree. I don't really know how you sustain a hit of 40% of your revenue going out there. I'm using 40% because that's, right around where pro teams and the unions end up coming around, between 40, 45%. I don't really know how you sustain that. And will it hurt women's sports? Sure, it'll certainly hurt men's sports as well. But again, I don't want to be the person that just doom and gloom.
Right.
If you're someone that's a fan of, men's football or men's basketball, those players would be compensated because they're the ones that are driving the revenue to the sport, driving those television deals, driving the jersey sales, driving the packed stadiums on Saturdays. So maybe that's fair in our capitalism world, but certainly a different world than we've been used to for the last century.
Paula says, Texas is a right-to-work state. How can schools, both private and public, unionize when the state is clear on their position?
I'm probably going to have to plead the fifth on that one as a New York-based lawyer.
Yeah.
Paula, you're right. But Paula, thanks for that. Let's see here. Someone just said, so in other words, there's no more recruiting. It's all just hiring. Isn't that what they do in the NFL? I mean, they get the draft, but that's it. Yeah.
Right. I mean, we for the last century, people make decisions based on playing time, based off of if they feel good with the coach, school spirit, all that. And maybe now you just make a decision. Hey, I could go to a school where I can get 40% of the pie, and that could be split amongst my teammates. Sign me up for that. I don't even need to play well. I'm going to get a check for basically doing nothing. So if you're a minimum salaried player in the NFL roster, you're getting a couple $100,000, right? You don't even have to play. So that's a certainly different world. And NIL in some sense is going to be school based. It's going to be, you still have to be a top player to be getting those endorsement deals. But if you're going to just say, hey, my school allows me, be it one of these private institutions, again, like a Northwestern, our television deal players get basically 1% of the television deal. It's a great arrangement that we have, or however much it would be divided up per player. Maybe that's a reason just to go to Northwestern, right? And there's no NIL deals. It's just, hey, these guys have gotten the right to unionize. They've collectively bargained, and Northwestern thought it would be appropriate to have a football team than to cancel it. And I guess, guys, we didn't mention this. Sometimes in our world outside of sports, sometimes you have employees that threaten to unionize, and employers say, hey, we can't actually afford to have you guys unionize. The shop would go out of business. So again, I don't want to be Mr. Doom and Gloom. We just have to talk about trends that have happened in reality. If maybe this collection of players at a particular school wanted to unionize, maybe you have a school that says, okay, I know you guys want to unionize, you have the right to unionize, but if you do it, we can't have this sport and have it be profitable, so we're just going to shut down that particular sport. All of these issues, right, are coming into play. So when I say it's kind of a black hole of issues, it's nothing that resembles the world of college sports as we know and love. It could be good, but it could be disastrous, certainly.
I just saw this quote, Dan, from Lincoln Riley. He said, I do worry that with our game, we're in a little bit of an in-between right now. Like, are we going professional? Are we not going professional? Are we amateurs? Are we not? It's like we're kind of trying to be halfway or both, and that ain't going to work. So that was from OU head coach Lincoln Riley. And it kind of goes.
Who can get the best of both worlds?
Yeah,
too,
he's actually got a lot on his side of the plate. But like, is there anything the NCAA like? We always bash the NCAA and talk about their inactivity or just leaving things up to other parties to decide. But in some cases, like, it made sense because their decision could have immediately changed based on the Congress or whoever making their decision. But is there really anything that the NCAA or the college athletics body can do to cut all or any of this off or have stemmed the tide in any way? Or is this all just inevitable and there's not really anything anybody could do about it?
It's kind of an avalanche at this point. I really think that this momentum is moving. Again, it's good or bad depending on what perspective you're on. I know, and we haven't talked about it in this conversation, but there are pro leagues that are popping up for college-aged players, and they're kind of banking on the NCAA falling apart. And players are saying, "Hey, I don't know what the hell is going on at this NCAA level, and I don't know what's happening with unionization. NIL. I'd rather just go get paid six figures to go play in a I'm going to call it a semi-pro league, but it would be a pro league for players ages 18 to 22. I know there's a soccer league that's formed, there's a basketball league that's formed. So, I don't know, could you do that? Sure. I don't really hear the NCAA doing much. I saw Mark Emmert's comments yesterday, David. I know you were watching as well. I don't sense that they're that worried about it. If you read their comments yesterday that they posted on Twitter, whenever that was, Wednesday or Thursday, I don't get the sense that they think it's a red alert scenario. But as a fan of old school college sports, I tend to think Lincoln Riley's opinion. I don't know what this world looks like. I like a world where you can have an extended roster of guys on the football team. You have 100 plus guys on the sidelines. Do you need to then switch to a format where you have a hard cap of 53 guys because you don't want to pay them more, and you have a practice squad of taxing guys? It's to his point, it's going to start looking a lot like the pros because of the money involved. So you'd have to be really, keep a really paper thin roster. And then we're not talking, guys, about like long-term disability benefits and what these players might want. Again, if you are a parent of one of these athletes, that's fantastic. But if you are someone that is kind of uneasy about what college sports will look like, this is certainly a problem. And then to the question, I don't really think there's anything the NCAA can do about it. If players get the rights to unionize, it's not up to the NCAA and the schools to, I guess make that decision for them. They have the right to unionize. So, unless there's schools that want to put their foot down and say, hey, we're going to cancel the program if you unionize, maybe that's the way to combat it. But I would hate to see a world where we're threatening lockouts and strikes and shutting down programs. That just seems like an apocalyptic college sports world, but certainly one that's fathomable at this point.
Thank you, man. You got anything else?
No, that's great stuff.
Dan,
really
you're
stuff,
incredible.
Yeah.
The text line, the chat room, Twitter, our board, all of them hanging on to all of what you're saying, and I know it could change tonight. But thank you so much, man. You're the best at doing it. Appreciate your time and being a part of the show.
Thanks, guys. Always a pleasure.
Dan Lust, sports law attorney and analyst. He's unbelievable at what he does.
And we need to keep in mind, this is not something that's been passed or, is even like being implemented in, anytime soon. This is very much a, thing that needs to play out over the course of some months and perhaps some years. But I think because of all the changes in college athletics, you see something like this and you can't help but go, whoa, like that right there is a game changer of a whole. Like NIL was one thing, but this is like an entirely different thing that really is not, like when NIL first came out, we were all like, oh my God, what's it going to be like? And then you kind of learn and you settle in and you go, okay, this is not as bad as you think. This, on the other hand, there's no like calming this down. This would actually be disastrous.
I don't think that the lawyer who made this statement, who did it, they are very much activist lawyers like this, and sometimes they're good to have, and sometimes they're bad. In this case, I don't think they've asked the question about what's the big picture here. They're looking at the one issue that's bothered them, that college athletes have been wronged over the years, and they're trying to right that by saying, well, this is how it actually is, when it's you have to look at it different. Like Dan said, you can't even wrap your head around how they'd have to change the whole thing.
Yeah, no question.
Yeah, is it worth unionizing if that means you're also eliminating 25% of college athletes as a result of it because of canceled programs and what might come of that? So, yeah, there would definitely be collateral damage.
There will be a blowback if they start dropping of the sports that are the non-revenue sports.
And that's the thing is, like, that's why
some did because of COVID.
Yeah, and that's why when that came out, I guess yesterday or the day before, is like be careful what you wish for type of thing. Like, yeah, it might make sense and you might have a point, but at the same time, is it really going to be that much beneficial to more than just a few people, or is it going to be more damaging to most?
Caden, I will send a text to Dan Lust or a direct message on your question. I didn't get a chance to get to it. New question: can schools make a player sign a non-competitive clause if they have?
Oh, if they leave the team.
If they or they leave the team after
Can I sign a non-compete?
Yeah.
So like if they left
non-compete in Texas don't hold up very well.
If they left the team,
but other states.
To his point, if they left the team, do they have to sign a non-compete so that they don't go sign with some other team?
Like you see in investment firms and in some other businesses
and that's
as well.
That's why I know we got to go. That's why I asked him was like, I know that the athletes are probably looking at this, and this last year's been wild for them. I mean, we're on the outside looking in, but all these athletes, all of a sudden they have like, hey, I can do a deal with Dr. Pepper, or I can do a deal with Jerry's Burgers down the street, or whatever. And then I'm sure there's probably some of them that saw this yesterday, and they go, union, we can negotiate. But, like, hopefully some of them are getting sound advice, because that was the point of my question is, like, if you're a track athlete or a tennis athlete or whoever, non-revenue sports, and you're jumping all over this thinking, like, hey, our payday's here, we're going to catch. Like, you might unintentionally be eliminating that program you're a part of in so many ways down the line. So, yeah, man, what a messy thing.
Yeah. All right, when we come back, and we blew through a break, but I hope you understand why our sponsors mean everything to us, because we're not on the air without them. But we're going to make it up a little bit.